911. What's your emergency? There are two men refusing to leave my store. They're being disruptive and making my staff uncomfortable. This is what woman said. You will see what happened next. Stay with us until the end to see. It was the Starbucks cafe where the hum of espresso machines and the chatter of customers filled, a familiar comfort to those seeking a break from the bustling city streets. Marcus and Elijah stepped into the warm space, shaking off the early spring chill. Both dressed in casual attire, Marcus in a navy hoodie and jeans, Elijah in a leather jacket and sneakers. They exuded an air of quiet confidence. Marcus glanced around the cafe, his sharp eyes scanning for an empty table. "Looks like it's packed today," he said. Elijah shrugged, his easygoing demeanor unfazed. "We'll grab a spot." Oliver said he'd be here soon. They found a small table near the window and sat down. Elijah leaned back, watching the steady stream of people coming and going. Marcus pulled out his phone, sending Oliver a quick text to let him know they had arrived. Across the room, Karen, the cafe's manager, frowned. She had been overseeing the busy afternoon rush when she noticed Marcus and Elijah walk in. Something about their presence unsettled her, though she couldn't put her finger on it. Or perhaps she could, and she didn't want to admit it. She marched over to the barista counter and whispered to one of the employees. "Do you know those guys?" she asked, nodding toward Marcus and Elijah. The barista, a young college student, shook her head. "No, I've never seen them before." Karen pursed her lips, her eyes narrowing. "They've been sitting there for a while without ordering anything. I'll handle it." As Karen approached their table, Marcus looked up, offering her a polite smile. "Hi, is there something we can help you with?" Karen folded her arms. "Are you planning to order something? This is a business, not a waiting room." Marcus's smile faltered, replaced by a look of confusion. "We're waiting for a friend. He'll be here any minute." Karen raised an eyebrow. "Well, unless you're buying something, you can't just sit here." Elijah exchanged a glance with Marcus. "We're not loitering," Elijah said calmly. "We're paying customers once our friend arrives." "Is that a problem?" Karen's tone hardened. "You need to order now or leave." The tension at the table was palpable, drawing the attention of nearby customers. Marcus took a deep breath, trying to maintain his composure. "We're not causing any trouble. We'll be happy to order as soon as our friend gets here." Karen didn't back down. "I'll give you 5 minutes." She turned on her heel and walked away, leaving Marcus and Elijah stunned. Karen paced behind the counter, her eyes fixed on Marcus and Elijah. Every time they exchanged a glance or checked their phones, her suspicion grew. She couldn't explain why their presence made her uncomfortable, but in her mind, it was justified. They didn't belong here. Not like the students typing on laptops or the business professionals holding impromptu meetings. The cafe was bustling, but a heavy silence lingered near Marcus and Elijah's table. A young couple sitting nearby watched the scene unfold, their faces etched with discomfort. Marcus tapped his fingers on the table, trying to suppress his irritation. He leaned toward Elijah and said under his breath, "This feels off. She's been watching us since we walked in." Elijah nodded, keeping his tone low. "Yeah, I noticed. Let's just wait for Oliver. He'll clear this up." Karen's footsteps clicked loudly as she approached their table again. She crossed her arms and tilted her head, her expression a mix of authority and annoyance. "I told you to order something or leave," she said, her voice sharper this time. Marcus met her gaze, his calm demeanor masking the anger simmering beneath. "We've explained this already. We're waiting for our friend. He owns this place." Karen let out a humorless laugh. "Sure, he does." Elijah frowned. "Why would we lie about that? Just call him and confirm." Karen ignored his suggestion. "If you don't order in the next minute, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." The murmurs of nearby customers grew louder. A middle-aged man at the counter glanced at the scene, visibly uncomfortable. "What's her problem?" he muttered to the barista, who looked equally uneasy but didn't respond. Karen returned to the counter, pulling out her phone. Her fingers hovered over the keypad for a moment before she made the call. 911. "What's your emergency?" the dispatcher asked. Karen's voice was clipped and steady, betraying no hesitation. "I'm calling from Starbucks on 5th and Main. There are two men refusing to leave my store. They're making my staff and customers uncomfortable. Are they threatening anyone? The dispatcher asked. Karen hesitated, glancing back at Marcus and Elijah. They were sitting quietly, their body language calm but visibly frustrated. Not exactly, she said slowly, but they're refusing to cooperate. The dispatcher pressed further. Are they armed? Are they behaving aggressively? Karen faltered, but her pride wouldn't let her back down. No, but they won't leave when I ask them to. The dispatcher paused, then assured her that officers would be dispatched. Karen hung up, feeling a mix of relief and vindication. She glanced back at Marcus and Elijah, her lips pursed tightly. She didn't notice the disapproving looks from customers who had overheard the call. Minutes later, the distinctive sound of sirens pierced the air. Marcus and Elijah exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of the situation sinking in. A few customers turned toward the door as two uniformed officers walked in, their presence commanding the room. Karen hurried to greet them, her posture rigid and self-assured. "Thanks for coming," she said. "Those two over there," she added, nodding toward Marcus and Elijah, "have been sitting here for nearly 20 minutes without ordering anything. I've asked them to leave, but they're refusing." The officers looked over at Marcus and Elijah, who remained seated but were visibly tense. One of the officers, a middle-aged man with a calm demeanor, approached their table. "Gentlemen," he said, his tone neutral, "we received a call about a disturbance. Can you tell us what's going on?" Marcus looked up, keeping his voice steady despite the knot forming in his stomach. "There's no disturbance. We're waiting for a friend who owns this Starbucks. He should be here any minute." The second officer, younger and less patient, glanced back at Karen. "She says you're refusing to leave." Elijah spoke up, his voice calm but firm. "We haven't done anything wrong. We're just sitting here waiting. She's the one who called you for no reason." Karen, still standing behind the counter, folded her arms. "They're not telling the truth. They've been giving me attitude since they came in." The older officer raised a hand to silence her, then turned back to Marcus and Elijah. "Do you have any proof that your friend owns this place?" Marcus sighed and pulled out his phone. "I texted him when we got here. He should be on his way. Can you wait a few minutes for him to arrive?" Before the officer could respond, Karen interjected again. "I don't think we need to wait. They've already disrupted my business enough." The younger officer, growing impatient, placed his hand on his belt. "Look, we're not here to argue. If the manager wants you to leave, you need to leave." The air in the cafe grew heavy, the tension palpable. Customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some pulling out their phones to record the incident. Marcus and Elijah remained seated, their calm demeanor a stark contrast to Karen's agitation. As the officers stood over them, Marcus felt a wave of anger and frustration. They had done nothing wrong, no crime, no disturbance, yet they were being treated like suspects. Elijah clenched his fists under the table, fighting the urge to react emotionally. They both knew the consequences of any misstep in situations like these. "Can we just wait for our friend?" Marcus asked again, his voice tinged with exasperation. The older officer seemed to consider this, but before he could reply, the cafe doors swung open. Oliver walked in, his face a mix of confusion and anger. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his voice cutting through the tension. Karen, relieved to see someone she assumed was on her side, hurried forward. "Thank goodness you're here. These two men were refusing to leave after I asked them multiple times. They weren't ordering anything, and I had no choice but to call the police." Oliver's eyebrows shot up, a flicker of anger flashing across his face. He turned to the officers, who were standing stiffly, unsure of how to proceed now that the cafe's owner was involved. "These two men," Oliver said, gesturing toward Marcus and Elijah, "are my friends. They're here to meet me." Karen froze. The blood drained from her face as she stammered. I didn't know." Oliver cut her off, his voice like ice. "Did they tell you they were waiting for someone?" Karen hesitated. "Well, yes, but what?" Oliver interrupted, his tone rising. "You assumed they were lying? You assumed that because they're black, they couldn't possibly be my guests?" The air in the cafe felt electric. Customers, many of whom had been recording the incident on their phones, leaned in to catch every word. Karen opened her mouth to respond, but no sound came out. She glanced toward the officers, hoping for support, but they stood silently, clearly unwilling to intervene. Liver stepped closer to Marcus and Elijah, his expression softening as he addressed them. "Are you guys okay?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. Marcus nodded, though his jaw was clenched. "We're fine, but this is ridiculous." Elijah leaned back in his chair, his voice measured but firm. "We explained to her multiple times that we were waiting for you. She didn't want to listen." Oliver turned back to Karen, his face hardening again. "Did you even try to call me? Did you think to ask for my confirmation before you called the police?" Karen's lips quivered. I didn't think it was necessary. I was just trying to protect the business." "Protect the business?" Oliver repeated, his tone incredulous. "From what? Two men sitting quietly and minding their own business?" The older police officer cleared his throat, breaking the tension. "Sir, it seems like this was a misunderstanding. We're going to leave now unless there's something else you need." Oliver waved them off. "No, thank you. I'll handle this." The officers nodded and walked out, their departure accompanied by a collective exhale from the customers. The moment they were gone, Oliver turned back to Karen, his expression unreadable. Karen fidgeted with her apron, her confidence from earlier completely eroded. "Look, Oliver, I didn't mean any harm. I was just following policy. If someone's not ordering, we're supposed to ask them to leave." "Policy?" Oliver said, his voice low but furious. "Our policy is to create a welcoming environment for everyone. That includes people who are waiting for friends, people who need a place to sit for a moment, and especially people who aren't causing any problems. You failed on every level." Karen's voice grew defensive. "But how was I supposed to know they were your friends? They didn't say anything." "They told you," Oliver snapped, cutting her off. "They told you they were waiting for someone, and you refused to listen because you made an assumption about them." Marcus stood up, his tall frame towering over the table. "Let's call it what it is," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You didn't see two men waiting. You saw two black men, and that was enough for you to call the cops." Karen's face flushed, and her eyes darted toward the floor. "That's not fair," she muttered. "I wasn't thinking about race." "Weren't you?" Elijah asked, standing as well. His voice was steady, but his expression was one of barely contained anger. "If we were two white men in suits, would you have reacted the same way?" Karen opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. The silence that followed was damning. The murmurs among the customers grew louder. A woman in her 30s, sitting near the counter, spoke up. "I saw the whole thing. They weren't doing anything wrong. You just didn't want them here." Another customer, an older man with a laptop, chimed in. "I've been sitting here for over an hour without ordering anything. Nobody's said a word to me." Karen looked around the room, her face a mixture of shame and panic. The realization that she had not only overstepped but had done so in a way that revealed her biases was sinking in fast. She glanced at Oliver, hoping for a lifeline, but his expression remained stony. Oliver gestured for Marcus and Elijah to sit back down, then turned to address Karen one final time. "We'll continue this conversation in my office," he said firmly. "For now, you're done for the day. Go home." Karen hesitated, as though she wanted to protest, but the weight of the moment kept her silent. She untied her apron, set it on the counter, and hurried out of the cafe, avoiding eye contact with everyone. As the door closed behind her, the cafe erupted in quiet applause. Marcus and Elijah exchanged a glance, both relieved and exhausted. Oliver sat down with them, his face softening for the first time. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice heavy with sincerity. "You shouldn't have had to deal with that. I'll make sure it doesn't happen again." Marcus nodded. "It's not your fault, but this kind of thing happens way too often." Elijah sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Yeah. The question is, what do we do about it?" Oliver's jaw tightened, and a determined look crossed his face. "We start by holding people accountable." The energy in the cafe shifted as Oliver sat with Marcus and Elijah. Customers returned to their drinks and conversations, though many cast lingering glances at the table where the three men sat. Some were still recording, their phones capturing what felt like a moment of reckoning. Others whispered among themselves, the word racism hanging in the air like a heavy cloud. Oliver ran a hand through his short-cropped hair, his frustration evident. "I can't believe this happened here," he said, his voice low but firm. "In my cafe." "It's not on you, Oliver," Marcus said, leaning forward. "You weren't here. But this? It's not just about today. It's about how people like us are treated, even when we're doing nothing wrong." Elijah nodded in agreement. "We've been here for 20 minutes, quiet and respectful, and she treated us like criminals. If you hadn't shown up, who knows how far this would have gone." Oliver sighed deeply, his shoulders sagging under the weight of their words. "You're right. This shouldn't have happened at all." He glanced at the customers still recording, and his expression hardened with resolve. Standing up, he addressed the room. "Everyone, I want to apologize for what you've witnessed here today," he said, his voice clear and steady. "This is not what Starbucks stands for, and it's certainly not what I stand for. These two men are my friends, and they were here as my guests. What happened was unacceptable." The murmurs of approval from the customers filled the room, some offering small nods of encouragement. After addressing the crowd, Oliver motioned for Karen to follow him into his office. Her steps were slow, her face a mix of anger and shame. She could feel the judgmental eyes of the customers on her back, and it stung more than she expected. Once inside the office, Oliver closed the door firmly and turned to face her. His expression was unreadable, which only made Karen's nerves worse. "Sit down," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Karen complied, folding her hands tightly in her lap. "Oliver, Oliver interrupted. "I don't want to hear excuses right now. I want to hear the truth. Why did you call the police on Marcus and Elijah?" Karen hesitated, her lips parting and closing again as she searched for the right words. I thought they were loitering," she said finally. "They weren't ordering anything, and they were taking up a table during a busy time." Oliver leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Did you ever stop to think that they might have a valid reason for being here? Did you even listen to what they told you?" I thought they were making it up," Karen admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "And why did you think that?" Oliver pressed, his tone sharp. "Was it because they didn't look like they belonged in this space? Or was it because they're black?" Karen's face flushed. "I didn't mean it like that," she said defensively. "I was just following policy." Oliver leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. "No, you were following your biases, not our policy. Our policy is to create an environment where everyone feels welcome. You failed to do that. Worse, you escalated the situation by calling the police instead of handling it professionally." Karen's eyes welled up with tears. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." "But it did," Oliver said firmly. "And now, thanks to your actions, this cafe is at the center of a social media firestorm. People are recording, sharing videos, and calling out this store, and by extension, me, for what happened. Do you have any idea how damaging this is?" Karen shook her head, tears slipping down her cheeks. I'm sorry." Oliver's voice softened, but his resolve didn't waver. "Sorry isn't enough, Karen. You didn't just make a mistake. You made a decision based on prejudice. That's not something I can overlook." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "You're fired, effective immediately." Karen's breath hitched, and she opened her mouth to protest, but the look on Oliver's face silenced her. She nodded numbly, rising from her seat. "I understand," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Good," Oliver said. "Now, gather your things and leave." As Karen left the office, Oliver returned to the cafe floor. Marcus and Elijah were still seated at their table, talking quietly. "It's done," Oliver said, sitting down with them. "She's gone." "Good," Marcus said. "But what about the bigger picture? Firing her doesn't fix the underlying problem." Elijah leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Yeah, this isn't just about her. It's about the culture that lets people think this kind of behavior is okay." Oliver nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You're right. This can't stop with her firing. I'm going to make some changes, not just here, but across all my stores. Marcus raised an eyebrow. What kind of changes? For starters, I'm implementing mandatory racial bias training for all staff, Oliver said. And I want to work with you too to create a program that uses this cafe as a space for community dialogue. Maybe even mentorship programs for young people. Something positive has to come out of this. Elijah smiled faintly, nodding. I like that. Turning something ugly into something good. Marcus's expression softened. We're in. Let's make it happen. The next morning, the cafe was quieter, but the tension from the previous day lingered like an unwelcome guest. Though the incident had concluded with Karen's dismissal, the fallout was far from over. By the time the sun rose, videos of the confrontation had already gone viral. Clips of Marcus and Elijah calmly explaining themselves to the police, juxtaposed with Karen's defensive demeanor, were being shared across social media platforms with hashtags like #StarbucksRacism and #BrewingJustice. Oliver sat in his office, scrolling through the posts with a heavy heart. The comments were relentless. Oliver's phone buzzed with calls and emails from corporate headquarters. They wanted a detailed report of the incident and a plan of action to address the growing PR nightmare. He sighed, rubbing his temples as the weight of the situation bore down on him. That afternoon, a group of protesters gathered outside the cafe. They held signs with slogans like "End Racial Bias" and "Coffee Shops for All." Oliver recognized some of the faces, regular customers who had always supported his business. Their presence stung, but he understood their frustration. Marcus and Elijah arrived as the protest grew, joining Oliver inside the cafe. The three of them watched the scene through the large glass windows. "This is bigger than just us now," Marcus said, folding his arms across his chest. "People are fed up, and they're right to be." Elijah nodded. "They need to see that you're listening, Oliver. That you're not just brushing this under the rug." Oliver turned to them, determination in his eyes. "I'm not. I want to talk to them. Let them know what we're doing to fix this." Marcus and Elijah exchanged a glance. "We'll back you up," Marcus said. Together, they stepped outside. The crowd quieted as Oliver raised his hands for attention. Cameras and phones turned toward him, capturing his every word. "Thank you all for being here," Oliver began, his voice steady despite the nerves swirling in his chest. "Yesterday, something happened in this cafe that never should have happened. Two of my friends were treated unfairly and targeted because of the color of their skin. That is unacceptable." A murmur rippled through the crowd, and Oliver continued. "I want you all to know that I fired the manager responsible for this incident. But firing one person doesn't solve the bigger problem. We need to address the biases that allowed this to happen in the first place." Elijah stepped forward, his deep voice carrying over the crowd. "This isn't just about Karen or Oliver Starbucks. This is about how we, as a society, treat people of color in everyday situations. We can't let this go unchallenged," Marcus added, "and that's why we're here. Not to shame, but to demand change." The crowd erupted into applause, the energy shifting from anger to hope. As the protest continued outside, Oliver received a call from Starbucks' corporate office. The public backlash had reached their headquarters, and they were scrambling to control the narrative. Oliver listened as a representative outlined their plans for damage control, including a corporate-sponsored apology and a promise to implement company-wide racial bias training. "We also want to use your cafe as a model for our new inclusivity initiatives," the representative said. "You handled this situation well, and we think your story can help rebuild trust." Oliver agreed, but only on the condition that his cafe would truly become a space for meaningful change. "I don't want this to just be a PR stunt," he said firmly. "We're talking about real people's lives. If we're going to do this, it has to be authentic." Corporate agreed, and within days, they rolled out a plan for training sessions, public forums, and community events hosted at Oliver's Cafe. Marcus and Elijah were invited to speak at the first forum, sharing their experiences and ideas for creating a more inclusive environment. As the protest continued outside, Oliver received a call from Starbucks' corporate office. The public backlash had reached their headquarters, and they were scrambling to control the narrative. Oliver listened as a representative outlined their plans for damage control, including a corporate-sponsored apology and a promise to implement company-wide racial bias training. We also want to use your cafe as a model for our new inclusivity initiatives, the representative said. You handled this situation well, and we think your story can help rebuild trust. Oliver agreed, but only on the condition that his cafe would truly become a space for meaningful change. I don't want this to just be a PR stunt, he said firmly. We're talking about real people's lives. If we're going to do this, it has to be authentic. Corporate agreed, and within days, they rolled out a plan for training sessions, public forums, and community events hosted at Oliver's Cafe. Marcus and Elijah were invited to speak at the first forum, sharing their experiences and ideas for creating a more inclusive environment. As the protest continued outside, Oliver received a call from Starbucks' corporate office. The public backlash had reached their headquarters, and they were scrambling to control the narrative. Oliver listened as a representative outlined their plans for damage control, including a corporate-sponsored apology and a promise to implement company-wide racial bias training. We also want to use your cafe as a model for our new inclusivity initiatives, the representative said. You handled this situation well, and we think your story can help rebuild trust. Oliver agreed, but only on the condition that his cafe would truly become a space for meaningful change. I don't want this to just be a PR stunt, he said firmly. We're talking about real people's lives. If we're going to do this, it has to be authentic. Corporate agreed, and within days, they rolled out a plan for training sessions, public forums, and community events hosted at Oliver's Cafe. Marcus and Elijah were invited to speak at the first forum, sharing their experiences and ideas for creating a more inclusive environment. The forum was held a week after the incident. The cafe was packed with customers, community members, and Starbucks employees. Oliver stood at the front, flanked by Marcus and Elijah, who each held the microphone in turn to share their thoughts. Marcus began, "What happened to us wasn't new. It's something Black people face all the time, being judged before we're even given a chance to explain ourselves. But what made this different was how Oliver stepped up. He didn't brush it off or make excuses. He took responsibility." Elijah added, "We're not here to shame anyone, but to start a conversation. Biases exist, whether we admit them or not. The question is, what are we going to do about them?" The crowd nodded in agreement, their expressions thoughtful. Oliver took the microphone last. "This incident taught me a hard lesson about leadership. It's not enough to run a business. You have to create a culture where everyone feels safe and respected. That's what we're working toward here." The event ended with a standing ovation, and the cafe felt transformed, not just as a place for coffee, but as a hub for dialogue and connection. Despite the positive steps taken, not everyone was satisfied. Critics on social media accused Starbucks of doing too little, too late, while others questioned whether Oliver's actions were genuine or just damage control. One particularly scathing tweet read, "Nice try, Starbucks. Firing one person doesn't erase years of racial bias baked into your corporate culture. Do better." Oliver knew he couldn't change everyone's mind, but he also knew that actions spoke louder than words. He doubled down on his commitment, partnering with Marcus and Elijah to launch a mentorship program for underprivileged youth. The program used the cafe as a meeting space, teaching young people about entrepreneurship and leadership. The backlash wasn't unexpected, but Oliver, Marcus, and Elijah chose to focus on the work ahead. They knew that creating lasting change would take more than one forum or a few training sessions. It would require a commitment to continuous action and accountability. Oliver transformed his Starbucks location into more than just a place to grab coffee. A corner of the cafe was dedicated to a community resource board, showcasing local events, mentorship opportunities, and educational programs. A sign above the board read, "Brewing Connections, Building a Better Community, One Cup at a Time." The cafe began hosting weekly events, from discussions on racial equity to workshops for aspiring entrepreneurs. Marcus and Elijah became key figures in these efforts, working closely with Oliver to organize and lead the sessions. During one workshop, a young Black woman named Tamika stood up to speak. "I've always felt like spaces like this weren't meant for people like me," she admitted. "But seeing what you're doing here gives me hope. It shows that change is possible." Her words resonated deeply with the audience, and Oliver felt a renewed sense of purpose. This is what it's all about, he told Marcus and Elijah later. Creating a space where everyone feels they belong. Meanwhile, Karen's firing hadn't gone unnoticed. She remained silent for days, but eventually, a local news outlet tracked her down for an interview. Her comments sparked controversy. "I made a mistake, and I've apologized," she said. "But I also feel like I was made a scapegoat. I was just doing what I thought was right for the business." Her remarks divided opinions. Some sympathized with her, claiming she was unfairly punished, while others saw her comments as an attempt to deflect responsibility. Marcus and Elijah weren't surprised by her reaction. "She still doesn't get it," Elijah said when he saw the interview. "She's more focused on how this affected her than on the harm she caused." Oliver nodded. "And that's exactly why we're doing this work. It's about educating people and challenging those blind spots." As Oliver's efforts gained traction, Starbucks' corporate office took notice. They offered to fund his initiatives and use his cafe as a pilot location for similar programs nationwide. Oliver accepted the support but insisted on maintaining control over the direction of the work. "I don't want this to become another PR campaign," he told the corporate team. "This needs to be real and impactful, or it's not worth doing." The partnership allowed Oliver to expand his efforts. He hired local activists and educators to lead workshops, ensuring the programming was both comprehensive and authentic. Marcus and Elijah took on larger roles within the initiative, using their experiences to connect with others. Marcus began mentoring young people in the community, sharing his journey from humble beginnings to becoming a successful entrepreneur. Elijah, a former educator, started leading sessions on recognizing and confronting implicit bias. During one session, a young white man named Jake raised his hand. "I never thought about how my assumptions affect the way I treat people," he admitted. "It's uncomfortable to realize, but I'm glad I'm learning." Marcus nodded, his tone encouraging. "That's the first step, acknowledging it. The next step is doing better." These moments of connection reinforced the importance of their work. Slowly but surely, they saw attitudes begin to shift. For Marcus and Elijah, the incident had been deeply painful, but they found healing in their newfound roles as advocates. One evening, as they sat with Oliver after a particularly successful forum, Marcus reflected on the journey. "Do you ever think about how different this could have gone?" he asked. "If you hadn't shown up that day?" Elijah nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It could have been another story about injustice, another viral video that leads nowhere. Instead, it became something bigger." Oliver leaned back in his chair, a small smile on his face. "That's because of you too. You turned this into a movement." "No," Marcus said firmly. "We all did. Together." As weeks turned into months, the narrative surrounding the cafe began to change. Media outlets highlighted the initiatives, and the community rallied around the effort. What had started as a moment of injustice became a beacon of hope and progress. Oliver, Marcus, and Elijah were invited to speak at national conferences on racial equity and corporate accountability. Their story became an example of how businesses could confront bias and create meaningful change. One afternoon, a young boy and his mother walked into the cafe. The boy, no older than 10, approached Marcus with wide eyes. "Are you the man from the video?" he asked. Marcus chuckled. "I guess I am. Why do you ask?" The boy grinned. "My teacher showed us the video in class and said you're a hero." Marcus's heart swelled, and he crouched down to meet the boy's gaze. "I'm no hero," he said gently, "but thank you. That means a lot." As the boy ran back to his mother, Elijah clapped Marcus on the shoulder. "Looks like you've got a fan base now." Marcus laughed. "If that kid grows up in a world where this kind of thing doesn't happen, then it's all worth it." If you like our story, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. Thank you, and see you there in the next video.